U.S. should get serious about this. We should suspend supporting Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, at the very least until we get assurances that this campaign does not distract against the fight against ISIS or al-Qaeda, and until we make some progress on this export of Wahhabism throughout the region and throughout the world.
Dedicated to Razan. I got to say, when I first started reading this, I got a chill when I read that line. In many ways, Razan's fate mirrors Syria's.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown in over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. The Saudis and the United States have been at war with Yemen for a year now. 8,000 dead, colossal physical destruction to the country of Yemen. No member of Congress has opposed this war until now. Last week, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut spoke out against any further support for the Yemen war in several venues. We'll show part of what he said on the floor of the Senate. He had stated that the U.S. did get some good out of its alliance with the Saudi government, but then he went on.
But increasingly, we just can't afford to ignore the more problematic aspects of Saudi policies. The political alliance between the House of Saud and the conservative Wahhabi clerics is as old as the nation. And this alliance has resulted in billions of dollars funneled to and through the Wahhabi movement. Those 24,000 religious schools in Pakistan, thousands of them are funded with money that originates in Saudi Arabia. So are mosques in Brussels, Jakarta, and Paris. According to some estimates, since the 1960s, the Saudis have funneled over $100 billion in funding to these schools all over the world with a mission of spreading puritanical Wahhabism. As a point of comparison, researchers suggest that the Soviet Union spent about $7 billion, a fraction of that, during the entire period of 1920 to 1991. Less well-funded governments and other strains of Islam they can't keep up with this tsunami of money behind the export of intolerance. Now, rightfully, Mr. President, we engage in daily castigations of Iran for sponsoring terrorism throughout the region. But why does Saudi Arabia largely get off the hook from direct public criticism from political leaders simply because they're a few degrees separated from the terrorists who are inspired by the ideology that their money helps spread? Why do we say virtually nothing about the human rights abuses inside Saudi Arabia, fueled by this conservative religious movement, when we so easily call out other countries for similar outrageous behavior? Second, Mr. President, we need to have a reckoning with the Saudis about the effect of their growing proxy war with Iran. Now, there's more than enough blame to be spread around when it comes to this widening Saudi-Iranian fault line in the Middle East. And I'd argue that the lion's share of the fault lies with the Iranians. They are the top exporter of terrorism and brutality. For decades, they have been. It's primarily Iranian-backed groups that have destabilized places like Lebanon and Iraq. It's the Iranians that are propping up a murderous regime in Damascus. But in the wake of the Iran nuclear agreement, there are many in Congress who would have the United States double down in our support for the Saudi side of this fight in places like Yemen and Syria, simply because Saudi Arabia is our named friend and Iran is our named enemy. But the Middle East, it just doesn't work like that anymore. And there's growing evidence that our support for a Saudi-led military campaign in places like Yemen are prolonging human misery and, frankly, aiding extremism. $90 billion in U.S. arms sales money has gone to Saudi Arabia during the Obama administration to help them carry out a campaign in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthis. Our government says that its top priority in Yemen is defeating AQAP, which is arguably al-Qaeda's deadliest franchise. But this ongoing chaos has created a security vacuum in Yemen in which AQAP can thrive and even expand. No expert would dispute that since the Saudi campaign began in Yemen, al-Qaeda has expanded in Yemen, and ISIL has gained new territory and a new recruitment foothold. And to make matters worse, Saudi Arabia and some of our other GCC allies are so focused on this fight against Iran that they have dramatically scaled back or, in some cases, totally ended their military efforts against ISIS. How, under these circumstances, does military support for Saudi Arabia help us in our fight against extremism, if that's our number one goal? So here are my recommendations. The U.S. should get serious about this. We should suspend supporting Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, at the very least until we get assurances that this campaign does not distract against the fight against ISIS or al-Qaeda, and until we make some progress on this export of Wahhabism throughout the region and throughout the world. And Congress shouldn't sign off on any more military sales to Saudi Arabia unless similar assurances are granted. If we are serious about constructing a winning long-term strategy against ISIS and al-Qaeda, then our horizons have to extend beyond the day-to-day, the here and now, the fight in just Syria and Iraq. We need to admit that there is a fight on for the future of Islam. And while we can't have the dispositive influence on that fight, we also just can't sit on the sidelines. Both parties here need to acknowledge this reality, and the U.S. needs to lead by example by ending our effective acquiescence to the Saudi export of intolerant Islam. And we need to be careful about not blindly backing our friends' plays in conflicts that simply create more instability, more political insecurity vacuums into which ISIS and other extremist groups can fill, like what's going on in Yemen today. Now, we need to work with the Saudis and other partners to defeat ISIS militarily, but at the same time, we need to work together to address the root causes of extremism. Saudi Arabia's counter-radicalization programs and new anti-terrorism initiatives, they're good steps that show that Saudi leaders recognize some of these problems. But they need to do more. Tackling intolerant ideologies, refusing to incentivize destabilizing proxy wars, these are the elements of a long-term anti-extremism strategy, and we should pursue this strategy, Mr. President, even if it makes us, on occasion, uncomfortable.
As he says, it goes beyond the war on Yemen. It's also the $100 billion spent on spreading the extreme hatred against other religions and human rights that's part of the Saudi Wahhabism. Here's Senator Murphy's phone number in D.C. Give him a call and leave a message. Tell him what you think about his stand on Yemen. Let other members of Congress know about what Senator Murphy is saying. Get them all to defund the Yemen war and to end the whole U.S.-Saudi alliance. Murphy's groundbreaking position will add new interest into the conference at the start of March in Washington about Saudi Arabia. Here's an updated list of speakers. Note one is Mohammed al-Nimr. He's the son of Sheikh al-Nimr, who the Saudis executed this year. We expect to video the conference. For more information, see our website, thestruggle.org. Last week, we had video of a meeting in London at the end of January. It featured Robin Yassin-Kassab, who has just finished a book on Syria. Here's more of that Amnesty International meeting.
Local councils, sometimes known as revolutionary councils, sprouted in 2012, especially and by necessity in the north as the regime withdrew. With the regime's retreat came the withdrawal of government services. Local councils ensured the provision of humanitarian aid and the fulfilment of basic needs, including water, electricity, education, and waste disposal. They coordinated on security with armed resistance groups. Councils follow no single model, and each has a different size and capacity. Members are civil activists, family and tribal leaders, people selected for their technical or professional skills. In general, they implement a form of representative democracy. Free local elections have been held in some areas, now I would say many areas. The first free elections in Syria in over 4 decades. Thank you.
The book by you and Leila is packed with memorable lines. I just wanted to open with this from the beginning. Syria was once known as a kingdom of silence. In 2011, it burst into speech, not in one voice, but in millions. For a few brief moments, the people changed everything. Then the counter-revolutions ground them down. One of the things that struck me reading this stunning book a note of pessimism. Even though you're touching on some of the alternatives, and those alternatives still exist, and we'll unpack that a little bit, some of the grassroots movements are still there. There was a pessimism there that this was an uprising that, in a sense, may have been doomed because of all the state actors and some of the more conservative elements within Syrian society itself. That was potentially going to grind down this more liberal or libertarian-minded, rights-based focus. Finished this book in, October last year? Are you more pessimistic since you finished this book about the direction of travel? Or is the alternatives, that positivity, is that still there?
The first thing to say is that I don't think it was the inherent weaknesses of Syrian society or the inherent conservatism of Syrian society which doomed the revolution, if it's doomed. Although Syrian society does, I don't have a rosy view of it, it does have many cleavages and serious problems, of course, which have been played on and exacerbated by the regime. But I think that Syrian society itself, not just liberal, middle-class, educated, what we would call educated people, but working-class and religious people as well, were, as Yara said here when she went to a conservative Muslim area, and one boy said, you should dress properly. Another boy said, don't talk to her, don't tell her what to do. We're here for our freedom, she should choose. Now, that doesn't mean that Maidan was about to become a liberal kind of New York or something, of course not. But it means that the ordinary working-class Syrian people were suddenly talking in public about these issues and debating them. So everything was up for grabs, and in some ways still is. I think it was the regime and its backers, and also the West and the Gulf in different ways, but it was primarily the regime. It was the counter-revolution and the violence of the counter-revolution and the sectarianism of the counter-revolution which brought us to the path that where we are now. But about optimism and pessimism, I think that you're constantly swinging between the two poles. I think that's true. I kind of wish that the last sentence of the afterword, I was not happy when I wrote it, I think the last word is annihilation. As a people who dared to ask for freedom received annihilation instead.
Exactly.
So that's fairly depressing.
Slightly, yeah.
I must... Look, here's my point of view. I am both pessimistic and optimistic. Most of all, I think, logically, I must be pessimistic because... Look at this situation. It's still exponentially increasing. When they're talking about a peace process and so on, it's theatre. It's like an Arab-Israeli peace process. It's not really a peace process. It's not designed to be a peace process. The Russian intervention, and we wrote all of the book except the afterword before that happened. The Russian imperialist assault, 80% of their bombs are hitting the opposition to both Assad and ISIS. They're hitting the people that you need to be there to be negotiating a future settlement. They're hitting democratic nationalists as well as Islamists. They're creating more refugees. There's 250,000 more displaced since the Russian bombing began. So this thing is getting worse and worse and worse, and I think that we have to speak very honestly and openly about that. When people pretend that we're heading towards a settlement, we're not. It's getting much worse, it's worsening, and that has immediate implications for everybody in the world because we're so globalized now. So I am pessimistic. Yeah. The counter-revolution has been awful. At the same time, that comes in the context of, the body of this book is the story that the media in general has not been telling you. The body of this book is about there are over 400 democratically elected local councils in Syria. There are tens of free newspapers and magazines which debate and discuss all kinds of things. There's a huge range of ideas amongst Syrians still inside and amongst refugee communities in exile. And that's not going away. So the positive way of looking at all the disasters in the Arab world in the last 5 years is that we're at the beginning of a very long process, and I don't know how it's going to end.
I think that's the interesting thing for me in this book. It's something we, as an organisation at Amnesty, deal with all the time in our working with civil society groups, and it's inevitable. Civil society groups the underground newspapers and what have you are not going to make headline news. Why would they? The news agenda likes things that explode, and they like the macabre theatre of ISIS and groups like that, obviously. But, it's interesting. I remember chatting with Anas Al-Abda, political committee for the Syrian coalition, and we were talking about positives and negatives. And I think, in one way, if you stand back and look at Syria and think where it was in February 2011, so a few weeks before what we would call the beginnings of the uprising, and where Syrian civil society is now, or where political opposition is, put aside the humanitarian crisis, put aside the massive destruction, it's more recognised, it's more well-funded, although that has its problems, and you touched on that in the book. It's got more awareness, it's more coordinated, it's got more ground, more territory inside Syria than it did. So in one sense, there's actually a lot to still build on. Yes. And if we move away, as you're touching on, if we move away from the news, the mainstream news filtered version of what's going on in Syria, and look at that grassroots, there is some positives. But I don't know if there's any. You talk about the local coordination committees a lot. Maybe people here don't know a lot about them. Some will do. I can see some people here who are very knowledgeable on Syria. Maybe expand a little bit about the LCCs and the vital work they have done and are still doing.
The local coordination committees, so before the councils, first kind of organic revolutionary organisation were coordination committees. The most well-known group of committees is called the local coordination committees, which Razan Zaytouni was very much involved with, in a human rights lawyer and revolutionary. And these were groups of 5 to 10 people, 7 people in each neighbourhood. And it was, of course, kept secret, because as soon as the regime found out who were in these committees, they would come and pick them up and kill them. And their first job was to coordinate protests. It was to organise protests in their local community and to coordinate with other committees. And they were also guiding things as much as they could in a positive direction. So, for example, if at a demonstration people spontaneously came out with a sectarian slogan or chant, somebody from the committees would run over and explain, look, this isn't helping us. That's just going to scare that community. It's going to make them think that we want to kill them. It's going to make them support the regime. And, so it was because of the local coordination committees that you found that every Friday you were seeing the same slogans and themes across the country. And then as the repression kicked in, Razan also set up the Violations Documentation Centre, which was connected to the committees. So a large part of their job became recording and documenting violations, recording and documenting first the crimes of the regime against the people, the deaths, the wounded, the etc., the rapes and all of this, getting the news out to the media, and then, of course, later, when the thing became militarized, I mean, Razan was offering human rights training to militias and so on, and she was... Razan Zaytouni, of course, is one of the Duma four activists who were kidnapped, abducted in 2013 in Duma, where they'd been living and working, probably by Jaish al-Islam, which is a militia run by Zahran Aloush, who was assassinated by the Russians recently. And because she was speaking out, Razan was the kind of revolutionary who was against every authoritarian wherever they came from. Now, since the abduction, I mean, that was a big blow to the local coordination committees, but they're still there. They're still in regime areas trying to organise when it's possible. It's much more difficult these days, protests. And keeping a network, an underground network of solidarity. When land was liberated and when it became a war situation and so on, then the councils started, and then you could have elections when the regime wasn't actually there able to pick people up. They could have elections and work in public.
And should say as well, the book is dedicated to Razan. I got to say, when I first started reading this, I got a chill when I read that line. In many ways, Razan's fate mirrors Syria's. The book is dedicated to her, of course, and every Free Syrian. And it's interesting as well because, you know, you would be in the sort of popular consciousness associated with as an anti-Assad figure, but it's probably more complex than that. Obviously, it's more anti-authoritarian. But you've chosen to dedicate, you and Leila have chosen to dedicate the book to somebody who, yes, had their run-ins with the regime, but ultimately, as most of us think, was disappeared by an armed opposition group. I'll say opposition in quotation marks to an extent because, you know, some could say groups like that have been actually counter-revolutionary forces against the ideals that people like Razan had. But it'd be interesting to know how that's gone down as well. You know, dedicating a book to someone like Razan, or has that not been explored yet fully within opposition circles, I should say? Because it is, I would say, it is a complex.
Today. This is the launch.
It is a complex point, I would say as well, because there was a meeting in Saudi Arabia of opposition groups which the Saudis pulled together, and we as an organisation persuaded some of the more human rights friendly people within the coalition, the Syrian coalition, to raise this case. And they were very nervous about doing it, but they did it, and the claw was on the Saudi government to pull some strings with Jaish al-Islam. It didn't happen, to my knowledge. It didn't happen. There was too much nervousness in the coalition. And, you know, you've touched on it in the book as well, that the Saudis and the Qataris, to an extent, have also been counter-revolutionary forces. How damaging do you think their involvement actually has been with the popular struggle?
I do think it has been damaging, and I'll say why. I don't know which to say first. Okay, first, it has been damaging. Of course, everybody's response has been damaging. The Free Army, the defectors from the military, the people who couldn't stand being ordered to shoot civilians every day, and local men who picked up weapons to defend themselves, who had no ideology other than we want to stop this regime killing us, and we want the Syrian people to choose what comes next. Those people should have been supported. They should have been supported properly in 2012, and it should have been done. Of course, the Free Army itself, you can blame them, you can blame the coalition, you can blame the fractiousness of the Syrians and everything else. But I think the fundamental point is that you had different sponsors very tepidly and not properly arming people a bit, but different sorts of people and different militias. And then you got all these militias in competition with each other. And then you got some making videos of, look, we're fiercer and more Muslim than the other militia, so you should give guns to us instead of... And so it should have been coordinated. The West didn't want to get involved for all kinds of reasons. It actually actively stopped the Gulf countries sending the weapons that the people really needed to defend themselves, because they said we're scared that Islamists might get hold of some of these weapons indirectly. Well, a few years later, look what's happening. The West is bombing both Syria and Iraq because there's such an enormous problem with jihadists that wouldn't have existed if they'd armed the Free Army in 2012. So the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks, by arming their own clients, contributed to this. The Qataris armed Islamists, not jihadists, but Islamists. The Saudis actually didn't. It's been really overdone. Apart from Jaish al-Islam, they've been funding Free Army groups, the Southern Front, and so on, because at the moment, as we saw in Egypt, where they helped Sisi's coup, they're scared of Islamism. Accept their own version. But Jaish al-Islam, when we come to organisations like Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham, these two, they're Syrian organisations. They're not like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS, international jihadist groups with an international global agenda. They're Syrian organisations, and both of them have said, whether they really think it or not, I don't know, but both of them have said that they are willing to work in some kind of democracy. They want an Islamic state, but they're not going to force it on the Syrian people. And both of them practically have shown themselves able to work with Free Army groups and local councils and people who think differently from them.
And just to show we have a sense of humor, some bitter satire from Apartheid Adventures.
At Apartheid Adventures, we say war crimes, s'more crimes. When you're defending a system of ethnic or religious privilege, otherwise known as apartheid, you have to imprison children, torture people, move your own population of the correct ethnic religious category into an occupied zone, and most of all, you have to target and kill civilians. But here's the good news. It's not a war crime. Just ask us. We'll tell you that we are the most moral army in the world because we have determined the exact number of civilians that we can legally and morally kill. 3.14 civilians per militant. We are not making this up. 3.14 civilians per militant. And best of all, who decides who's a militant? We do. Militants can include government officials or off-duty police officers or teenagers who might someday become militants, or people who don't get out of the way of militants, or people who have seen a militant anytime lately, or who live in the same zone as a militant. So even that exact number, 3.14 civilians killed per militant, has plenty of room for expansion. Why, in the summer of 2014, when we killed over 2,000 people in Gaza, more than 1,400 of them were civilians, but that's still only 2.28 civilians per militant, so we're good. That's right, if you're Israel, killing civilians is okay, and war crimes are not war crimes. So keep on supporting Israel's war crimes with your tax dollars, and keep on supporting our apartheid partners like Elbit Systems, building walls from the West Bank to Arizona, and building more surveillance and lethal drones to keep your privilege safe. Remember that same summer we killed those 1,400 civilians in Gaza? The profits of Elbit Systems went up 6%. War crimes are good for business. And shut up, they're not even war crimes. So that's why we never stop attacking Gaza. We kill an average of 2 children a week in Gaza. Why? Because we can. Apartheid Adventures, ethnic privilege, and we mean it.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. This is Stanley Heller for The Struggle.